Jake Thompson had spent years dreaming of a place like this. Quiet, woodsy, away from the buzz of the city. His new home sat on a generous plot at the edge of a forested ridge, with a small clearing in the back that overlooked a rolling valley. Birds chirped, the wind whispered through the trees, and for once in his life, he could breathe. That feeling lasted exactly 3 days. It started with the crunch of gravel on Monday morning. Jake had just stepped out with a cup of coffee when he saw movement near the tree line. A man in running gear trotted out of the woods, glanced at Jake's house without breaking stride, and disappeared down a dirt trail, right through Jake's backyard. No wave, no hello, just gone. Jake blinked. Maybe the guy got lost, but the next day it happened again. Only this time it was a pair of women in hiking boots, chatting loudly and sipping from metal water bottles. They too marched confidently through Jake's yard, stepping around his newly planted azaleas, without even noticing him. A dog barked happily behind them, off-leash, sniffing along what looked to be a well-trodden footpath. Jake followed them from a distance. Curiosity piqued. The trail was real, carved into the soft earth, winding deeper into the woods. It looked like it had been used for years, maybe decades. Still, his property map, which he'd studied obsessively before closing, showed a clear boundary line. The trail ran straight through the rear third of his land. No easement, no right-of-way. Jake walked the path all the way to where it emerged onto a public park about a quarter-mile away. There, a weathered wooden sign read, "Whispering Pines Trail, community use encouraged." Community. Back at home, he checked the county GIS map again. No mention of any official trail easement. He scanned the HOA welcome packet too. Nothing about a public trail, shared use, or land access agreements. The next morning, he decided to test a theory. He moved one of his patio chairs across the trail's midpoint and sat there, coffee in hand, waiting. It didn't take long. A teenage girl with earbuds in approached and stopped cold at the sight of him. "You're blocking the trail," she said, annoyed. Jake raised an eyebrow. "You mean the path that cuts across my private property?" She hesitated, then muttered, "It's always been here." Before turning around and retracing her steps, that phrase stuck with him. Always been here. Like it was an unspoken rule. A secret handshake. Jake didn't like secrets, especially the kind he hadn't agreed to. Later that afternoon, while trimming the hedge near the front lawn, he noticed a black SUV rolling slowly by, the window half down. A woman with short blonde hair and oversized sunglasses stared at him like he was the one trespassing. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just kept driving. Jake didn't know it yet, but he'd just had his first encounter with Karen Delaney, the undisputed queen of the HOA and self-appointed protector of neighborhood traditions. Her gaze lingered a few seconds too long. And that trail, it wasn't just a walking path. It was sacred. Jake didn't have to wait long for the SUV to return. The very next morning, just after he finished repairing the garden bed some hikers had trampled, the same black vehicle pulled into his driveway with the mechanical precision of a tank. The driver's door creaked open, and out stepped the woman who had stared at him the day before, this time with a clipboard in hand. "Good morning," she said with a smile so tight it could cut glass. "Karen Delaney. I'm the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association." Jake wiped his hands on a towel and walked over. "Jake Thompson. I just moved in last week." "Yes, I know," she said, already scanning his front yard with calculating eyes. "We like to keep track of new arrivals. Make sure everyone gets a proper welcome." "Appreciate that," Jake replied cautiously. Karen held up her clipboard like a badge of authority. Now, just a few things to cover. I took a quick look around and noticed a few items that don't align with our community standards. For example, your mailbox doesn't appear to be HOA compliant, and those patio chairs out back. We typically discourage furniture on natural trail zones. Jake frowned. You mean the trail that cuts through my backyard? Karen's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. Yes, the community trail. It's been there since the neighborhood was founded. Decades now. It's part of our charm. Jake folded his arms. There's no easement on my deed. No mention of shared access. Karen gave a soft chuckle, almost pitying. Oh, honey, that's not how it works. Just because it's not on paper doesn't mean it isn't real. We're a community. People here have used that trail for years. You fencing it off would be deeply disruptive. And letting strangers walk across my land like it's a public park? Jake asked, voice steady but hardening. That's not disruptive. Karen stepped closer, dropping the smile. You seem like a reasonable man, Jake, but let me be very clear. The residents here value tradition, and they don't respond well to change. People walk that trail every day. Kids, families, retirees. If you stir the pot, you might find it boiling. Jake stared at her for a beat, then nodded slowly. I appreciate the visit. He turned to walk back toward his porch. I'll be filing a notice about the mailbox. Karen called after him. And you might want to look into repainting your fence. Regulation colors only. Jake didn't respond. He went inside, locked the door, and sat at his kitchen table with a quiet exhale. The conversation had been polished on the surface, but underneath, it was something else entirely. A warning. He pulled out his laptop and began typing a list. Confirm property lines again. Research HOA bylaws. Start keeping records of interactions. Install cameras. Because now he wasn't just dealing with trespassers. He was dealing with Karen. And Karen wasn't just protecting a walking path. She was guarding a territory. Jake sat alone in the Whispering Pines HOA clubhouse, gripping a manila folder stuffed with survey maps, legal descriptions, and property line diagrams. The meeting room smelled like lemon-scented cleaner and stale coffee. A semicircle of board members sat across from him, behind a long oak table, pretending this wasn't an ambush. At the center of them sat Karen Delaney, fingers laced under her chin, like a judge waiting to sentence a criminal. Jake cleared his throat. Thanks for letting me speak today. I'll keep it short. I'm here to address the issue of the hiking trail that cuts through my property. Karen raised a brow. You mean the community trail? Jake ignored her. According to both the county assessor's office and my property deed, there is no easement, public or private, allowing anyone to use that trail. It runs through my land, and it's being used without permission. He laid out copies of the map and survey, sliding them across the table. Silence. One board member, Tom, a weary-looking man in his 60s, glanced at the paperwork, then quickly looked away. Beside him, a woman with a notepad scribbled something and avoided eye contact. Karen didn't even glance down. Jake, with all due respect, this trail has been used by the neighborhood for over 30 years. It's part of our heritage. These kinds of traditions don't always require ink and signatures. Jake's voice was calm but steely. This isn't about tradition. It's about the law, and the law says it's my land. Karen leaned back in her chair. So you're saying you're planning to fence it off? Block access? I'm saying I have every right to. Karen's smile returned. Tight. Plastic. That would be extremely disappointing. You're new here, Jake. You may not realize how deeply people feel about the trail. Removing it could cause division, anger, chaos. That's not how we like to do things. There it was again, that veiled threat wrapped in honey. Jake let the silence stretch, a beat too long before replying. I'm not the one starting the fight. I'm just drawing a line, literally. Another board member, a younger guy in a golf polo, finally spoke. Maybe we should look into the records, see if anything was ever filed. Karen cut him off with a polite but icy tone. We've already looked. There's nothing official, but the board has discretion to maintain community amenities. And that trail is an amenity. Jake stared at her. An amenity on private property? Karen smiled wider. You'll find the community has a way of enforcing what's fair, Mr. Thompson. Jake gathered his papers without another word. He walked out of the clubhouse with his heart pounding, not from fear, but from clarity. This wasn't about oversight or misunderstanding. This was coordinated gaslighting. The board wasn't neutral. They were complicit. Some of them probably used the trail themselves. As he stepped into the sunlight, he noticed something else. 3 neighbors were standing across the street, watching the meeting from the sidewalk. One of them whispered to another and quickly turned away when Jake looked in their direction. Whispers, watches, silence from the board. Jake knew then. This trail wasn't just a habit. It was a power structure, and he had just walked into the middle of it. Jake woke early the next morning, a restless energy pulsing through his veins. The board meeting had left him shaken, not because of fear, but because of resolve. If the HOA and Karen Delaney wouldn't respect the law, then he'd have to enforce his rights himself. He stood on his back porch, looking over the border between his property and the dense woods beyond. The narrow dirt trail cut through the undergrowth like a scar, worn bare by countless footsteps. For years, neighbors had walked it without a care, but this was his land, and now it was time to act. By mid-morning, Jake had rented a truck and driven to the local home improvement store. He picked out tall, sturdy cedar posts, galvanized wire fencing, and everything he needed for a boundary line that would be impossible to ignore. His hands trembled, not with fear, but anticipation. That afternoon, he began hammering posts into the earth along the edge of his property, erecting a fence that sliced across the infamous trail. Each post was a declaration: no trespassing, private property, enough. By sundown, a neat, imposing fence stretched across the woods, blocking the path completely. The silence that followed was deafening. The next morning, Jake woke to the sound of loud voices outside. Peeking through the blinds, he saw a gathering crowd near the fence. Neighbors whispering, pointing, and shaking their heads. The usually friendly community had turned into a restless mob overnight. Jake stepped outside, heart pounding. From the crowd, Karen Delaney emerged, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she approached. Jake, she said, voice cold but loud enough for others to hear. You've made a huge mistake. He met her glare steadily. This is my property. The trail is illegal. Karen's laugh was sharp, almost cruel. Illegal. There's no such thing here. The people have walked that trail for decades. You've cut them off without warning. You're going to face consequences. Jake's jaw tightened. What consequences? I'm within my rights. Karen raised her voice, addressing the gathering neighbors. If this fence stays, it'll break the community apart. You don't want that, do you? Murmurs spread through. The crowd, some looked angry, others looked confused. Suddenly, a woman from the back stepped forward. I walk that trail every day. My kids play there. This fence ruins everything. Jake replied firmly. You don't have the right to walk through my backyard. We can find alternative routes. Karen's eyes glittered with triumph. You think you're going to win this? will bring the full weight of the HOA down on you. Fines, citations, lawsuits. You'll regret this fence." As she spoke, Jake noticed a man filming the confrontation on his phone. The neighborhood was watching now, and whatever happened next, it would not stay quiet. That night, Jake found a note slipped under his door. The handwriting was jagged, aggressive. "Fence down by dawn or else. This is our trail, not yours." Jake's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about a property dispute anymore. It was a battle for control, and Karen Delaney was leading the charge. The next days brought an escalating campaign of harassment. His trash bins knocked over, suspicious footprints near the fence, and calls from unknown numbers warning him to give up. But Jake refused to back down. As tension swirled like a storm cloud over whispering pines, Jake knew one thing for certain. The fence had changed everything. Jake hadn't expected the fence to cause such a stir. What started as a simple boundary marker quickly spiraled into something far uglier. Every morning, he found his trash cans toppled over, lids smashed, and sometimes strange items tossed. Inside, broken glass, dead leaves, even a half-burnt matchstick. Whoever was behind it was sending a message. You don't belong. One evening after a long day at work, Jake discovered the worst yet. His front tire was flat, punctured by a sharp nail that hadn't been there that morning. The word sabotage echoed in his mind, and with it, a sinking feeling that this fight was escalating beyond words. He installed security cameras, hidden but with clear views of the fence line in the street, and began meticulously recording every suspicious moment. Several times, he caught shadows slipping past the perimeter late at night. Once, a figure paused to glare at the cameras before disappearing into the darkness. Despite all this, Jake's neighbors stayed silent. The friendly waves and casual hellos were gone, replaced by a cold distance and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever he approached. One afternoon, while trimming the hedge, Jake noticed a black sedan parked across the street. He squinted and saw Karen Delaney inside, watching him with a look that chilled him to the bone. No greeting, no smile, just cold, calculating eyes behind tinted windows. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You should stop fighting. This neighborhood protects its own." The message was clear. The fence wasn't just a physical barrier. It had built a wall between Jake and the entire community. The days bled into one another in a haze of tension. Every creak of a branch, every distant footstep, sent Jake's heart racing. He wondered how far Karen and her allies would go, and what they might do if pushed too far. One evening, as Jake sat reviewing security footage, he caught something unexpected. A familiar face on the trail, sneaking along the fence line after dark. The figure paused, fumbled with a tool, and then began loosening a post. Jake froze. The saboteur was one of the HOA board members. A cold wave of betrayal washed over him. This was no neighborhood dispute. It was a conspiracy. He called the police and reported the vandalism, but without direct proof of who had committed it. The officers could do little more than file a report. The HOA board stonewalled any questions when he confronted them. Karen, however, was nowhere to be seen. One night, Jake awoke to a noise outside. Grabbing a flashlight and baseball bat, he stepped into the backyard. In the beam of light, he caught a shadow fleeing into the trees, a neighbor's dog barking furiously after it. His fence, once sturdy and proud, now showed signs of wear. Loose boards, deep scratches, even a torn section where someone had tried to create a makeshift passage. Jake felt isolated, hunted. The conflict had seeped into every corner of his life, poisoning what should have been a peaceful retreat. Yet, amidst the tension, A stubborn ember burned inside him. He wasn't going anywhere. Jake decided to dig deeper. If Karen and the board were hiding something, he'd find it. He spent hours scouring public records, cross-referencing HOA meeting minutes, and interviewing a few hesitant neighbors who slipped him cryptic hints about past controversies and things better left alone. One whispered comment stuck with him. Karen's got her fingers in everything. That trail isn't just a path. It's her power base. The realization hit Jake like a punch. This wasn't just about land. It was about control. And Karen Delaney wasn't just fighting for a hiking trail. She was fighting for her kingdom. Late into the night, Jake sat hunched over his laptop, piecing together a puzzle no one in Whispering Pines wanted uncovered. The deeper he dug, the more tangled the web became. There were no official easements for the trail. That much was certain. But buried in a decades-old HOA meeting minute, almost faded beyond legibility, was a cryptic reference to a community corridor and an informal agreement that neighbors wouldn't obstruct access. Signed by a handful of long-gone residents, the agreement wasn't recorded with the county. It wasn't legally binding, but it had been treated like gospel by the HOA ever since. Even more curious was a series of property transfers from the 1980s, where a developer had sold plots without mentioning the trail. The land deeded to Whispering Pines, HOA, did not include the trail area, yet somehow, Karen and her predecessors had maintained control over it for decades. Jake's breath caught when he uncovered a name repeatedly tied to the trail's unofficial ownership. A man named Harold Delaney, Karen's late father. Suddenly, Karen's fierce protectiveness made sense. This trail was more than a community path. It was her family legacy. He clicked on a news clipping dated 25 years ago. It told a story about a bitter dispute when the Delaneys had nearly lost a chunk of land to a neighboring development. The trail had been a bargaining chip in negotiations, a symbol of power over the growing neighborhood. The article ended with a quote from Harold Delaney. "This trail is our heritage and our shield." Jake leaned back, stunned. The trail wasn't just a walking path. It was a symbol of control, woven into the very fabric of Whispering Pines' history. The next morning, Jake returned to the fence, eyes scanning the wooded edge. If the trail was Karen's legacy, then the battle wasn't just legal, it was personal. He knew he couldn't just build a fence and expect peace. He had to understand the history to break the hold it had on the neighborhood. He decided to talk to Eleanor, an elderly neighbor rumored to have been close to the Delaney family. He found her tending a rose bush in her front yard, eyes sharp. "Despite her age, Mrs. Crane?" Jake began. "I'm Jake Thompson, new here. I was hoping you might help me understand the trail. And the Delaneys." Eleanor smiled wistfully. "Ah, the trail. It's been a part of this place longer than I have." Harold Delaney was a man who believed in tradition, sometimes too much. The trail was his symbol of community spirit and control. It kept the neighborhood united, or at least under his thumb. Jake frowned. Under his thumb. Karen inherited that mindset. Eleanor said softly, "She's fighting to protect more than just dirt and trees. She's protecting her family's name." Jake thanked her and left with a knot tightening in his chest. That afternoon, Jake received an unmarked envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a single photo. Karen, standing proudly beside the trail, arms crossed, flanked by a group of smiling neighbors. The handwritten note on the back read, "This isn't just a path. It's our history. Don't erase it." Jake's mind raced. The stakes were higher than he'd imagined. This wasn't just about property rights. It was about legacy, pride, and unyielding power. But Jake had a choice. He could back down, or he could fight. and the fight was just beginning. The night of the emergency HOA town hall meeting arrived like a storm, rolling in over the hills. Whispering Pines residents packed the small community center, the air thick with anticipation and simmering anger. Word had spread fast about Jake's fence and the escalating feud. The room buzzed with whispers and side conversations. Everyone wanted to see who would crack first. Jake stood near the back, his heart pounding as Karen took the podium. She looked poised and unshakable, wearing the armor of authority, like a queen defending her kingdom. "Thank you all for coming," Karen began, her voice calm but commanding. "We are here to discuss the future of our beloved trail and the fence that threatens to divide us." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some faces showed frustration, others curiosity, but most reflected the same underlying fear: change. Jake stepped forward when Karen finished her introduction. "I'm Jake Thompson," he said clearly, scanning the sea of eyes. "I understand why the trail is important to many of you, but it runs through my property. I built this fence because I have a right to privacy and safety on my land." Karen's smile tightened. "And yet, Mr. Thompson, this fence blocks access to a path that our community has cherished for generations. You might have the legal right on paper, but we have the moral right of tradition." Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the crowd's gaze. "Tradition doesn't give anyone the right to trespass. I'm willing to work on a compromise, maybe a legal easement, or rerouting the trail along the edge of my property. But I won't tolerate illegal access." A hand shot up from the crowd. A young mother with 2 children by her side. "Jake, that trail is where my kids learn to ride their bikes, where we all gather in the summer. You fencing it off feels like you're tearing the community apart." Another neighbor chimed in. "We've lived here for decades. The trail is more than dirt and trees. It's our history." Karen nodded solemnly. "This isn't just about a fence. It's about preserving the spirit of Whispering Pines." The tension in the room tightened like a noose. Jake knew he had to shift the narrative, or risk being painted the villain. "I respect that," he said. "And I want to find a way for all of us to coexist. But that means respecting property lines and legal rights. Let's stop fighting in the dark and start working openly." For a moment, the room fell silent. Then, Karen's voice cut through sharply. "Mr. Thompson, you think this is about cooperation. You underestimate how much control this trail gives us. I'm afraid this fence isn't the end. It's just the beginning." Suddenly, she pulled out a thick folder and slammed it onto the podium. "I have here the results of a community survey. Over 80% of residents oppose this fence. The HOA is prepared to take legal action against you." The crowd stirred, some voices rising in support, others whispering doubts. Jake felt the walls closing in, but before panic could take hold, a calm voice interrupted. "I move that we form a mediation committee," said Tom, the older board member Jake had met before. "Let's find a solution that respects both property rights and community needs." Karen's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. The motion passed with murmurs of agreement and dissent. Jake felt a flicker of hope and dread. Hope that this battle could be settled peacefully. Dread that Karen's war wasn't over. As the meeting broke up, Karen approached Jake with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Watch your back, Jake," she whispered. "This isn't just about land, it's about power, and I don't give up." Jake watched her go, the weight of her threat settling like a stone in his gut. The fence had started a fight, but the war for Whispering Pines was far from over. The mediation committee met for weeks, but progress was slow and fraught with tension. Karen stayed resolute, insisting the trail remain open, exactly as it had been for decades, while Jake pressed for legal boundaries and respect for his privacy. The neighborhood was split down the middle, some fiercely loyal to Karen, others quietly supporting Jake's rights. One evening, as Jake was locking up his house, the doorbell rang. He opened it to find Eleanor Crane, the elderly neighbor who had shared stories of the Delaney family, standing on his porch, looking nervous but determined. "I think you need to see this," she said, holding out a faded envelope. Inside were a handful of old photographs and handwritten letters dating back over 50 years. The letters revealed a different story than the one the HOA had promoted. The trail had originally been a private path on the Delaney estate, never meant for public use. Over time, the Delaneys had encouraged neighbors to use it unofficially, but had always maintained ownership and control. Eleanor's voice trembled. Karen's father built that trail to protect his family's privacy and power. It was never a community easement. Jake's heart raced. This was the proof he needed. Historic documents showing the trail was not a public right-of-way. The next day, armed with the letters and photos, Jake called for an emergency meeting of the HOA board and mediation committee. The room buzzed with whispered speculation as he laid the evidence on the table. Karen's confident mask cracked. She glanced nervously at the documents, then shot Jake a glare, sharp enough to cut glass. "This changes everything," Jake said quietly. "The trail is private property, not a community easement. The fence is legal, but I'm still willing to work out a reasonable access plan, something that respects both my rights and the neighbor's wishes." For a tense moment, no one spoke. Then Tom, the older board member, nodded slowly. "We've been misled by decades of assumptions and politics. It's time to be honest." The community grudgingly agreed to a new compromise. Jake would create a designated walking path along the edge of his property, carefully maintained and fenced for privacy, allowing controlled access without trespassing into his backyard. Karen's reaction was telling. She stormed out, refusing to sign the new agreement. Her power fractured. Weeks later, Jake walked the new trail with Eleanor, breathing in the fresh pine air and listening to the faint sounds of the neighborhood beyond. The fence still stood tall, but peace had settled over whispering pines, like a fragile dawn. As he looked back at the woods, Jake realized the fence hadn't just protected his land. It had uncovered the truth, buried beneath years of silence and control, and in doing so, it had reshaped a community. Karen's kingdom had crumbled, not with a fight, but with facts. Jake smiled, knowing the battle was over. But the story of Whispering Pines was far from finished.